The early morning sun cast long shadows across the peaceful streets of Charleston, South Carolina, as Sarah Mitchell drove her rental car through the historic district. The air conditioning hummed softly, providing relief from the sticky southern heat that was already building, even at 8:30 in the morning. Sarah was tired but focused, having spent the last 3 days interviewing local residents for her upcoming BBC documentary. At 42 years old, Sarah had built an impressive career as a foreign correspondent, traveling to some of the world's most dangerous places to report on important stories. She had covered wars in the Middle East, political upheavals in Africa, and natural disasters across Asia. But this assignment in Charleston felt different, more personal somehow. She carefully followed her GPS directions through the quiet suburban streets, lined with beautiful old oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The rental car, a modest blue Toyota Camry, moved smoothly along the road as Sarah mentally reviewed her schedule for the day. She had 2 more interviews planned with local community leaders about their experiences with the justice system. At the corner of Maple and Pine Street, Sarah came to a complete stop at the stop sign. She looked left, then right, then left again, a habit ingrained from her 20 years of driving in countries around the world. Seeing no other cars, she proceeded through the intersection. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser that had been parked under a large oak tree suddenly pull out and turn on its lights. Sarah's heart rate increased slightly, but she remained calm. She had done nothing wrong. Following standard procedure, she turned on her right blinker and pulled over to the curb, positioning her car well out of traffic. She turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and waited. Through her side mirror, Sarah watched as a tall police officer approached her car. His nameplate read Officer Thompson, and he walked with the confident stride of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Sarah noticed he had already placed his hand near his holster, a small detail that didn't escape her trained journalist's eye. "License and registration, ma'am," Officer Thompson said, his tone clipped and professional. His sunglasses made it impossible for Sarah to read his expression. "Certainly, officer," Sarah replied calmly. "My license is in my purse on the passenger seat, and the rental car registration is in the glove compartment. Would you like me to get them now?" The officer nodded, and Sarah moved slowly and deliberately. Years of working in tense situations had taught her the importance of clear communication and careful movements. She handed over her British driver's license and the rental car papers, watching as Officer Thompson's eyebrows raised slightly at her international ID. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" he asked, studying her license carefully. "No, sir, I don't," Sarah replied truthfully. "I was following all traffic laws and came to a complete stop at the sign back there." Officer Thompson shook his head. "That's not what I observed, ma'am. You rolled through that stop sign without making the complete stop. That's a violation of South Carolina Traffic Code Section 56 to 52740. Sarah felt a flutter of frustration in her stomach, but kept her voice steady. "Officer, I respectfully disagree. I made a complete stop and looked both ways before proceeding. In fact, I have a dash cam that recorded the entire incident." The officer's posture stiffened slightly. "Ma'am, arguing with an officer about a citation will only make things worse. You failed to come to a complete stop, and as a foreign driver, you need to understand that we take our traffic laws very seriously here." Sarah noticed how he emphasized the word foreign and made a mental note of it, the journalist in her never truly off duty. She also noticed that Officer Thompson had made no attempt to look at her dashcam footage or consider her side of the story. "Here's your citation," he said, handing her a yellow ticket. "You'll need to appear in court next Monday at 9 a.m. if you wish to contest this. Otherwise, you can pay the fine online or at the courthouse. Have a nice day." Before Sarah could respond, Officer Thompson had already turned and was walking back to his patrol car. She looked down at the citation in her hand, noting the court date and the listed violation. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she thought about the irony of the situation. Here she was, researching a story about bias in the American justice system, and she had just become part of her own story. Sarah placed the citation carefully in her briefcase, where it sat next to her BBC press credentials and her notebook filled with interviews about systemic bias. She started her car and pulled carefully away from the curb, her mind already working on how this personal experience might add another layer to her documentary. Little did Officer Thompson know that his routine traffic stop had just entangled him in a story that would soon make international headlines. Hashtag Part 2. Preparation for court. Back in her hotel room at the historic Charleston Inn, Sarah Mitchell sat at the small wooden desk near the window, surrounded by papers and her open laptop. The afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on her work surface. A half-empty cup of English breakfast tea sat cooling beside her as she prepared for Monday's court appearance. Sarah had been staying in this hotel for the past week, its historic charm and central location making it perfect for her documentary work. The room's old-world elegance, with its four-poster bed and antique furnishings, provided a stark contrast to the modern equipment spread across her desk, her laptop, recording devices, and multiple hard drives containing hours of interviews. "This is quite unexpected," she mumbled to herself as she connected her dashcam to her laptop. The small device had become a habit for her after years of reporting in difficult situations. She never imagined it would come in handy during a simple assignment in South Carolina. The video played clearly on her screen, showing her car coming to a complete stop at the intersection. She watched it 3 times to be absolutely certain. Sarah reached for her phone and called her producer in London. Despite the 5-hour time difference, James Peterson answered on the second ring. "Sarah, is everything all right? It's nearly midnight here." James's familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "James, I think our story just got more interesting," Sarah replied, her journalistic instincts buzzing. "Remember how we were struggling to find a personal angle for the documentary? Well, it seems I've become part of the story." She explained the morning's events to James, who listened intently. As she spoke, Sarah organized her documents into neat piles: her traffic citation, her press credentials, statistics on traffic stops in Charleston, and transcripts from her interviews with local residents who had similar experiences. "This could be powerful," James said thoughtfully. "A foreign journalist experiencing firsthand what we've been investigating. Have you checked the officer's record?" Sarah smiled, already pulling up a document on her laptop. "Of course. Officer Thompson has had 3 complaints filed against him in the past 2 years, all from minority drivers claiming unfair treatment. None of the complaints were upheld." She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the historic streets below. Groups of tourists walked past, taking photos and enjoying the beautiful weather. They seemed worlds away from the reality she had been uncovering in her interviews. Stories of systemic bias, unfair treatment, and institutional racism. Sarah returned to her desk and opened her interview notes from the past week. She had spoken with 15 local residents, 3 civil rights lawyers, and 2 former court employees. Their stories formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Her own experience now added another piece to this complex puzzle. Taking out a fresh notepad, Sarah began preparing her statement for court. She wrote carefully in her clear, journalist's handwriting, making sure every word was precise and purposeful. Years of reporting had taught her the power of words, and she wanted to be ready. Next, she prepared her evidence folder: the dashcam footage saved on a USB drive, her BBC credentials, statistics on traffic stops in Charleston showing racial disparities, and character references from her colleagues at the BBC. She even included a copy of her recent award for international journalism, not out of vanity, but as proof of her credibility. As evening approached, Sarah ordered room service, a simple dinner of grilled chicken and salad. She ate at her desk while reviewing South Carolina traffic laws on her laptop. The more she researched, the more convinced she became that this wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. This was about something much bigger. Before going to bed, Sarah made one final call to her local contact, Marcus Jenkins, a respected civil rights attorney in Charleston. "Just be careful, Sarah," Marcus warned. "Judge Henderson has a reputation. He doesn't like being challenged, especially not by," he paused. "Especially not by people who look like me," Sarah finished his sentence. "Exactly," Marcus sighed. "But maybe that's exactly why this needs to happen." Sarah ended the call and looked at her organized desk with satisfaction. Everything was ready for Monday. As a journalist, she had faced down warlords and corrupt politicians. She had reported from war zones and disaster areas. A traffic court appearance shouldn't be intimidating at all. Yet something felt different about this. Perhaps it was because this time she wasn't just reporting the story, she was living it. As she prepared for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Monday's court appearance would be more than just a simple traffic hearing. It would be a test of the very system she had come to investigate. She set her alarm for early Monday morning, knowing that whatever happened in that courtroom would become part of her documentary. Whether Judge Henderson knew it or not, he would be playing a starring role in a story that would soon be seen by millions around the world. Part 3, the courtroom. Monday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of humidity hanging over Charleston. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit that spoke of professionalism and confidence. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked through the security checkpoint, her organized folder of evidence tucked neatly under her arm. The courthouse was an impressive building, its architecture reflecting the city's rich history. Tall columns stretched up to a decorated ceiling, and the morning sunlight streamed through large windows, creating patterns on the polished floor. Despite the building's beauty, Sarah couldn't help but notice how it felt designed to make people feel small and powerless. As she followed the signs to courtroom 3B, Sarah observed the other people waiting in the hallway. Most were dressed casually, some looking nervous, others resigned. She noticed she was the only person of color among those waiting to contest their tickets. This detail didn't surprise her. It fit perfectly with the pattern she had uncovered in her research. A young mother sat nearby trying to quiet her baby. An elderly man kept checking his watch anxiously. A teenager in a fast food uniform looked like he might be missing work to be here. Sarah pulled out her small notebook and began making observations, her journalist's instincts never truly off duty. At exactly 8:55 a.m., a court officer appeared. He was a heavy-set man with gray hair and a stern expression. "All those here for traffic court, please line up to enter," he announced in a voice that suggested he had said these words thousands of times before. "No phones, no recording devices, no talking once inside." Sarah joined the line, purposely positioning herself near the middle. As a journalist, she had learned that sometimes the best observation point wasn't at the front or back, but somewhere in between. From here, she could watch both the judge's behavior with those before her and gauge the reactions of those still waiting. The courtroom itself was smaller than she expected, but no less imposing. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and the judge's bench was raised high above the floor, forcing everyone to look up when addressing the court. The American flag hung in one corner, its stars and stripes perfectly arranged. The smell of old wood and furniture polish filled the air. Judge William Henderson entered precisely at 9:00 a.m. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His black robe seemed to add an extra layer of authority to his already commanding presence. "All rise," the court officer called out, and everyone scrambled to their feet. As the proceedings began, Sarah watched Judge Henderson carefully. He moved through the first few cases with mechanical efficiency. Those who simply pleaded guilty received their fines quickly. Those who tried to explain their situations were often cut off mid-sentence. Sarah noticed how his tone changed subtly depending on who was speaking. She observed as a young white college student received a reduced fine after a brief explanation about being late for an exam. Minutes later, a Hispanic man with limited English skills tried to explain his situation, but was quickly silenced and given the maximum fine. Sarah's pen moved quickly across her notebook, recording every detail. Time seemed to move slowly in the stuffy courtroom. The wooden benches were hard and uncomfortable, but Sarah sat straight, reviewing her evidence one final time. She watched as the crowd slowly thinned, each case taking between 3 to 5 minutes. Some people left looking relieved, others angry or defeated. Finally, after what seemed like hours, she heard her name. "Case number 247, Sarah Mitchell," the court officer called out. Sarah stood, gathered her materials, and walked confidently to the podium in front of the judge's bench. As she moved forward, she could feel Officer Thompson's presence behind her. He had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom all morning. Judge Henderson barely looked up from his papers as she approached. His eyes scanned her citation briefly, then moved to her driver's license. Sarah noticed the slight raise of his eyebrows as he registered her British license, followed by an almost imperceptible frown. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "you are charged with failing to stop at a stop sign. How do you plead?" Sarah stood straight, her posture perfect, her voice clear and professional. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for her response. Little did Judge Henderson know, but this moment, this seemingly routine traffic court appearance, was about to become far more significant than anyone in the room could imagine. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet courtroom. She placed her evidence folder neatly on the podium in front of her. The early morning sunlight streaming through the high windows cast long shadows across the wooden floor, making the scene feel almost theatrical. Judge Henderson looked down at her over his reading glasses, his expression a mixture of boredom and mild irritation. "And what evidence do you have to support your plea, Miss Mitchell?" His tone suggested he had heard every possible excuse 100 times before. Sarah opened her folder with steady hands. "Your Honor, I have dashcam footage showing my complete stop at the intersection in question. Would you like to view it?" She held up the USB drive containing the video. The judge waved his hand dismissively. "That won't be necessary. Officer Thompson is a decorated member of our police force with 15 years of experience. Are you suggesting he made a mistake?" Sarah remained composed, though she noticed Officer Thompson shifting in his seat at the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply presenting evidence to support my case, as a professional." "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson interrupted, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Let me explain something about how we do things here in Charleston." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the bench. "We respect our law enforcement officers. They put their lives on the line every day to keep our streets safe." Sarah tried again. "I understand that, Your Honor, and I respect." "I'm not finished," the judge cut her off again. The few remaining people in the courtroom watched with growing interest. "Your attitude suggests a lack of respect for our legal system. Perhaps things are different where you come from, but here in South Carolina, we take our traffic laws seriously." Sarah felt a familiar flutter in her stomach, the same feeling she got when she was about to uncover something important in her investigations. She noticed how the judge emphasized where you come from and made a mental note of it. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice steady and professional, "I have the utmost respect for both law enforcement and this court. However, I believe everyone has the right to present evidence in their defense. If you'll allow me just 2 minutes, Stowe." Judge Henderson's face reddened slightly. "Ms. Mitchell, your continued interruptions are trying my patience. I see here you're driving with a foreign license. Perhaps you're not familiar with our customs, but when a judge is speaking, you listen." The court officer took a small step forward, sensing the growing tension. The remaining spectators in the courtroom sat perfectly still, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion tennis match. Sarah stood her ground, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. Years of interviewing difficult subjects had taught her how to maintain composure under pressure. She waited until the judge finished speaking, counting to 3 in her head as she had done countless times in tense situations around the world. "Now," Judge Henderson continued, shuffling the papers on his bench, "given your attitude and apparent disregard for our procedures, I'm inclined to impose the maximum fine. Do you have anything to say before I make my ruling?" This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She could see all the elements of her story coming together: the dismissal of evidence, the prejudiced assumptions, the abuse of authority. It was all happening exactly as her interviewees had described. "Your Honor," she spoke clearly and calmly, "I would like to note for the record that you have refused to review my evidence, interrupted my defense multiple times, and made several comments about my nationality that seemed irrelevant to this case. Would you care to explain your reasoning?" The judge's face darkened. Members of the gallery exchanged glances. Even the court officer raised his eyebrows slightly. He raised his gavel, ready to make it official, clearly expecting Sarah to back down like so many others before her. But Sarah Mitchell had faced down dictators and warlords in her career. This small-town judge's attempts at intimidation only strengthened her resolve. As the gavel hung in the air, Sarah reached into her briefcase, ready to reveal her true identity. The next few moments would change everything, not just for her case, but for the entire Charleston judicial system. The courtroom air grew thick with tension as Judge Henderson's gavel remained suspended in the air. Sarah's hand moved slowly but deliberately inside her briefcase, her fingers touching the familiar leather case that held her BBC credentials. The morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the judge's face, highlighting the stern lines around his mouth. $500, Judge Henderson repeated firmly, and consider yourself fortunate that I don't hold you in contempt of court. His voice carried the weight of someone used to having the final word, someone who had never been challenged in his own courtroom. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nobody ever talked back to Judge Henderson, and certainly nobody had ever questioned his methods so directly. The court officer stood straighter, his hand moving slightly closer to his belt, though Sarah noticed this detail with the calm observation of a seasoned journalist. Officer Thompson, still seated at the back of the courtroom, leaned forward slightly. Something about Sarah's composure seemed to make him uneasy. She wasn't reacting like other drivers he had ticketed. There was no anger, no pleading, just a controlled confidence that seemed out of place in this small traffic court. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering similar moments in her career when everything hung on what she would do next. She had faced down armed guards in war zones, confronted corrupt officials in third-world countries, and investigated dangerous criminal organizations. This moment, though different, carried the same weight of importance. "Your Honor," she began, her British accent now more pronounced than before you finalize that decision, I believe there's something you should know. Her hand emerged from her briefcase, holding not just her BBC credentials but also a small digital recorder. Judge Henderson's face darkened further. "Ms. Mitchell, I've already warned you about your attitude. If you think some kind of recording device will—" "This isn't a threat, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted smoothly, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "It's merely professional courtesy. You see, I've been recording this interaction in my capacity as a journalist, just as I record all my professional encounters." The judge's hand holding the gavel trembled slightly. "Journalist?" he questioned, his voice losing some of its previous authority. Sarah stood even straighter, her professional demeanor unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. Sarah Mitchell, Senior International Correspondent for the BBC News. I'm currently working on a documentary about bias in the American justice system, with a particular focus on traffic courts in the southern United States." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Henderson's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. Officer Thompson stood up from his seat, then sat back down, unsure of what to do. The remaining spectators in the gallery watched with wide eyes, some pulling out their phones despite the court's no-phone policy. "I've spent the past week interviewing Charleston residents about their experiences in traffic court," Sarah continued calmly. "I've gathered quite interesting statistics about fine distributions, racial disparities in traffic stops, and patterns of judicial behavior. Your courtroom, Judge Henderson, has featured prominently in my research." The judge slowly lowered his gavel, placing it on the bench with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the sunlight as he adjusted them nervously. "Of course," Sarah added, her voice still professional and controlled, "I would be happy to share my dashcam footage with the court. Perhaps we could review it together. I'm sure our international audience would appreciate seeing the American justice system's commitment to fair and unbiased review of evidence." Judge Henderson's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. His years of unchallenged authority suddenly felt very fragile under the international spotlight Sarah had just introduced. The court officer looked uncertainly between the judge and Sarah, waiting for instructions that didn't come. The remaining cases on the docket seemed forgotten as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Judge Henderson reached for the glass of water beside his bench, taking a long, slow sip as he visibly tried to collect himself. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its previous arrogance, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should review that evidence after all." The atmosphere in courtroom 3B had transformed completely. The remaining people in the gallery sat frozen, phones now openly recording despite court rules. The morning sun continued to stream through the high windows, but the air felt different, electric with anticipation. Sarah connected her USB drive to the court's computer system, her movements calm and practiced. The large screen on the courtroom wall flickered to life, showing the crystal-clear dashcam footage from the morning of her traffic stop. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner. "As you can see, Your Honor." Sarah spoke clearly, her British accent now seeming to command more attention than before. My vehicle came to a complete stop at the intersection of Maple and Pine Street. The stop lasted for exactly 3 seconds before I proceeded. Judge Henderson watched the video with a tight expression, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The footage was undeniable. Sarah's car had indeed made a full and proper stop. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face showing growing concern. Furthermore, Sarah continued, pulling out a thick folder from her briefcase, I have your data from the past 3 years of traffic court proceedings in Charleston. The statistics show some rather interesting patterns. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Would you like me to share these findings with the court? The judge's hand moved to loosen his collar slightly. Miss Mitchell, he began, his voice notably softer than before, perhaps we should discuss this in chambers. With all due respect, Your Honor, Sarah replied professionally, I believe transparency serves justice best. My BBC camera crew is currently outside the courthouse, preparing for our afternoon filming session. They would be very interested in documenting this discussion. A murmur ran through the gallery. Someone near the back whispered, BBC. And suddenly phones were being used to search Sarah's name online. Within moments, people were looking at her professional profile on the BBC News website, complete with photos from her coverage of international conflicts and political summits. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed the screen to Judge Henderson. On it was a direct message from her producer in London. Live feed ready when you need it. Global news desk standing by. The judge's face had turned an ashen color. His years of unchecked authority were crumbling before his eyes. The small traffic court case he had treated so dismissively was about to become international news. My documentary team has spent the last week interviewing dozens of Charleston residents, Sarah explained, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent courtroom. We've collected numerous accounts of similar experiences in this courtroom. Evidence dismissed without review, different standards applied to different defendants, and consistently higher fines imposed on minorities and foreign visitors. Officer Thompson stood up suddenly. Your Honor, I should explain. Please remain seated, officer. Judge Henderson cut him off sharply, clearly trying to regain some control of the situation. The judge turned back to Sarah, attempting to compose himself. Miss Mitchell, clearly there has been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. Everything that has happened in this courtroom today, your dismissal of evidence, your comments about my nationality, your attempt to impose the maximum fine without proper review, has been documented. The only question now is whether you'd like to provide a statement for our global audience about your judicial practices. The court officer looked desperately at Judge Henderson for instructions, but the judge seemed lost in thought, likely calculating the impact this would have on his career. The other cases waiting to be heard were forgotten as everyone watched the drama unfold. Sarah stood patiently at the podium, her posture perfect, her expression professional. She had orchestrated similar moments in her career before, that precise instant when truth confronts power, when the comfortable patterns of authority meet the disinfecting light of public scrutiny. Perhaps, Judge Henderson finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, we should start this hearing over. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, with a proper review of all evidence, of course. Sarah nodded slightly, but she wasn't finished. This wasn't just about her traffic ticket anymore. This was about every person who had sat in this courtroom feeling powerless, every citizen who had faced bias disguised as justice, every voice that had been silenced by the bang of that gavel. By noon, the steps of the Charleston courthouse were crowded with news crews. The story of a BBC journalist exposing potential bias in the South Carolina traffic court had spread like wildfire through social media. Local news vans parked alongside national network crews, their satellite dishes reaching into the bright southern sky. Sarah stood at the top of the courthouse steps, surrounded by microphones and cameras. Her navy blue suit looked as crisp as it had that morning, her composure unchanged despite the morning's dramatic events. Behind her, a steady stream of people flowed out of the courthouse, many stopping to take photos or videos with their phones. What began as a simple traffic stop has revealed concerning patterns in our judicial system. Sarah spoke clearly into the forest of microphones. This isn't just about one traffic ticket or one judge. It's about equal justice under law, a principle that should apply to everyone, regardless of their race, nationality, or social status. Inside the courthouse, Judge Henderson sat alone in his chambers, his black robe hanging heavily on his shoulders. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. The Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court had already called twice. His secretary had brought him a printout of social media trending topics. His name was number 3 in the United States. In the courthouse parking lot, Officer Thompson sat in his patrol car, watching the growing media circus through his windshield. He had already received a message from his supervisor requesting an immediate meeting. His dashboard computer showed that reporters had dug up his previous complaints, and they were now being discussed on national news. Local civil rights organizations began arriving at the courthouse around 1 p.m. They carried signs and banners, their leaders giving impromptu interviews to the gathered press. Marcus Jenkins, the civil rights attorney who had warned Sarah about Judge Henderson, stood among them, a satisfied smile on his face. "We've been trying to expose these practices for years," Marcus told a CNN reporter. "Sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to shine a light on problems we've grown too accustomed to seeing." Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from her BBC colleagues around the world. The London news desk had already scheduled her for a live appearance on their evening news broadcast. Her producer, James, had sent a simple message. "This is bigger than we imagined. Well done." By mid-afternoon, the story had gone truly global. News organizations from Britain, France, Germany, and Japan were running stories about the American traffic court judge caught on camera showing bias. Social media platforms were flooded with clips from Sarah's courtroom confrontation, captured on phones by spectators despite the court's no-recording rule. The Charleston City Council called an emergency meeting. The mayor's office released a statement promising a thorough review of all judicial practices. Civil rights organizations announced plans for a larger protest the following day, demanding an investigation into all of Judge Henderson's past rulings. Back in her hotel room, Sarah sat at her laptop, typing rapidly. Her original documentary about bias in the American justice system had just gained an unexpected new chapter. The screen showed dozens of email requests for interviews, comments, and appearances. But her focus remained on the bigger picture. "The system only works when it works for everyone," she wrote in her notes. Today showed what happens when unchecked authority meets public scrutiny. Around 5 p.m., a formal statement was released from Judge Henderson's office. He announced he was recusing himself from all current cases pending a full investigation. The statement included carefully worded apologies for any appearance of impropriety and promised full cooperation with any review of his conduct. As evening approached, Sarah stood by her hotel room window, watching the sun set over Charleston. The city looked peaceful from up here, its historic buildings glowing in the orange light. But beneath that peaceful surface, changes were beginning to ripple through the system. Her phone rang again, another news organization requesting an interview. But Sarah's mind was already on tomorrow. She had more interviews scheduled with local residents, more data to collect, more stories to uncover. What had started as a simple traffic stop had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. In the distance, she could still see the courthouse, its classical columns now cast in shadow. Tomorrow would bring more cameras, more questions, more demands for accountability. But for now, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes she thought, justice needs a witness. 3 months after the courthouse confrontation, Sarah Mitchell sat in her London office at BBC headquarters, reviewing the final cut of her documentary. The large screen on her wall showed familiar scenes of Charleston's streets, interwoven with powerful interviews and courtroom footage. The documentary, titled Justice on Trial, Bias in the American Courts, had become much more than her original vision. What started as an investigation into traffic court practices had sparked a movement for judicial reform across South Carolina and beyond. Sarah's desk was covered with newspapers from the past few months. The headlines told the story of what had happened after her courtroom revelation. Judge Henderson resigns amid investigation. Charleston court system under federal review. New guidelines for traffic courts implemented. South Carolina launches judicial bias training program. The investigation into Judge Henderson's past cases had revealed disturbing patterns. Over his 15-year career, he had consistently imposed higher fines on minorities and foreign visitors. Hundreds of his cases were now under review, and many convictions had already been overturned. Officer Thompson had been reassigned to desk duty pending completion of additional training. The police department had implemented new rules requiring all traffic stops to be recorded, and regular reviews of officers' stop patterns were now mandatory. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Jenkins, the Charleston civil rights attorney. He had sent a photo of the courthouse's new electronic signboard, which displayed information about rights and procedures in multiple languages. "Look what you started," his message read. The BBC documentary had aired in 47 countries, sparking discussions about judicial bias worldwide. Sarah had received invitations to speak at law schools, civil rights conferences, and even before the United States Congress. Her simple traffic stop had become a case study in journalism's power to affect change. Back in Charleston, things had changed significantly. The new traffic court judge, an African-American woman named Patricia Reynolds, had implemented a strict evidence review policy. Every defendant now had the right to present their full case, including video evidence, without interruption. The courthouse lobby now featured a large screen displaying daily statistics about traffic stops, fines, and case outcomes, broken down by demographics. This transparency initiative had been dubbed the Mitchell Rule by local media, much to Sarah's embarrassment. More importantly, other journalists had taken up the cause. Local reporters in cities across America were now investigating their own traffic courts, looking for similar patterns of bias. Sarah's story had created a template for exposing systemic problems in local justice systems. In her London office, Sarah clicked through more recent photos from Charleston. The civil rights organizations had maintained their momentum, creating a citizen oversight committee for the courts. They had even started a legal fund to help people who couldn't afford to contest their tickets. Her computer pinged with an email from James, her producer. The documentary had just been nominated for a prestigious journalism award. But that wasn't what made Sarah smile. It was the attached photo of a new sign at the intersection of Maple and Pine Street, where her story had begun. The sign read, "Full stop required. All citizens equal under law." Sarah turned back to her screen, watching the documentary's final moments. The camera panned across the Charleston courthouse as her voiceover played. Justice isn't just about laws on paper. It's about how those laws are applied, who they protect, and who they punish. Sometimes it takes a small incident to expose a larger truth. The scene shifted to interviews with local residents, sharing their stories of facing bias in court. Their voices were no longer afraid or resigned. They spoke with hope about the changes they were seeing, about feeling heard for the first time. As the sun set outside her London office window, Sarah thought about all the people who had been affected by that one morning in traffic court. Judge Henderson had retired to avoid further investigation. Officer Thompson had completed his retraining and was now leading workshops on bias awareness for other officers. The courthouse had new policies, new leadership, and a new commitment to equality. But most importantly, people in Charleston and beyond had learned a powerful lesson. Justice deserves a witness, and one person's stand can create lasting change. Sarah's simple decision to challenge unfairness had rippled out into the world, touching lives far beyond that small southern courthouse. The documentary ended with a simple statistic. Traffic court fine disparities in Charleston had dropped by 67% in the 3 months since the reforms began. Below the number, a quote appeared. "Justice is not just for some, it's for all." Sarah Mitchell, BBC News.